countries therefore have accumulated debt, which of course is indeed living off the cost of the taxation that will be paid by future generations. But the scale of it is so immense that we can't even talk about the next generation. The debt that's currently accumulated will never be paid off. It cannot be paid off.
But the globalists have a solution for this, and I'd like to ask you about that. Because they, who create the problem, might actually create the problem because they want a different kind of solution. It's a cultural hijack.
Well, that's the Great Reset.
What will that entail for this generation that's now depressed? We have 50% of people between 15 and 25 who are depressed. The other 50% is depressed, but they don't know it. They feel depressed because they feel that there's a debt above their head that they can't ever pay. Welkom bij een aflevering van Hoop Helder Hulleman. Ditmaal in English. Or should I say British, the British language. And we have an honorable guest, Sir John Laughland.
Not so.
Ah, there you go. Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, perhaps.
Let them come.
Will it?
No.
So, the modest Mr. John Laughland, the author of The Tainted Source, which I've read rapidly because it is very easy to read. And it describes the period where I sort of, as a young man, started seeing that there's something wrong in the world. So my first question for you would be, imagine me to be 25 years old today, looking around into the world, what am I to expect?
Well, this very question was put to me by one of my own French students. I teach in a university in Western France, and a girl put up her hand and asked exactly that question. What can we do? She said, what can we do? And then the poor girl asked the same question again during her oral exams. So there were 3 of us on the jury and she was alone. So the first time was in front of 100 of her colleagues, of her fellow students. And then the second time was just with 3 professors. And she asked the question almost with tears in her eyes. So it was a very sad moment because she seemed to be on the verge of despair, given that the world is in a very bad way. And there she is, age 20, faced with the prospect of having to live in the ruins of what used to be a great civilization. And I felt sad as well because I don't have an answer. I didn't have an answer, and I don't have an answer. Charles Maurras, the great counter-revolutionary monarchist French philosopher of the 20th century, said that despair is the most stupid thing in politics. I think that hope is the most stupid thing in politics. I think that despair is, on the contrary, an entirely appropriate attitude to have in the face of what's happening. But on the other hand, I do have to slightly correct myself. In a way, the question, what can we do? Or what should we do? Is to some extent the wrong question. We all know what we don't all know, but some of us know what
we feel.
Some of us feel, for instance, if we believe in morality and so on, then, or ethics or whatever, we base our actions on those ethical decisions, on our moral view of the world. And that's what we have to do, is we have to live our lives in accordance with morality. But we don't live our lives in accordance with some goal. Or we're not all at management school. It's not about achieving some objective. So I would say that we have to simply live our lives as best we can, to tell the truth as best we can, because the specific characteristic, I would say, of this general crisis is that it is a crisis of truth. It's a crisis of a relationship to reality. And I was very struck recently when Tucker Carlson was sacked from Fox News. He went on, perhaps you saw it, I think it got 3 million views. He went on and said...
I was one of those 3 million.
Yeah, so was I. So there we are. That's 2 down and several million to go. And he said something in that thing about, we collectively are stronger than they who are lying. We who are telling the truth are stronger than they who are lying. And that message reminded me of what Solzhenitsyn wrote in the letter to the Soviet leaders in 1973, one of his longer essays. And of course, what Václav Havel wrote also in that period, perhaps a bit later, in 1978, I think, he wrote... Václav Havel wrote an essay called, I think, Living in Truth. And both of them said that what they found unbearable about the communist system was the fact that it was based on lies, based on ideology and lies. And that, of course, is very, very similar to our own predicament. And that in those circumstances, all you can do is try to live in truth. And I'm sure if you'd asked them in 1973 or 1978, what to do and what they expected they could achieve by doing what they were doing, they would have probably answered with the same level of despair as I am. But history has proved that despair to be wrong. So that's my answer. We live in truth.
You mentioned communism in the Soviet era. Do you see an analogy with what's happening to the continental Europe and maybe even Britain?
It's more than an analogy. I genuinely believe, and I've lectured on this and written on it over almost 2 decades now, that Marxism did not die in 1991, that instead it simply transmogrified, or rather went back to a more sort of original form of Marxism. Another writer from that part of the world, Milovan Djilas, says that the essence of communism was not state control of the means of production. It was not the planned economy. Instead, the essence of communism was dialectical materialism and the primacy of change.
Cultural change.
Change as in general, political change, the primacy of change, the idea that everything is in a state of constant flux. And that
it's the nightmare for a conservative.
Yes, and that there is no fixed reality, that there is no knowable fixed reality because everything is in a state of Heraclitean flux. And that was Djilas's view of the essence of communism. And my view is that when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, liberal internationalists decided that the global economy and the borderless world was indeed this primacy of change that Marx himself, Marx and Engels particularly, even more so Engels actually than Marx, had advocated and had said was the primary characteristic of reality. And so that's why we see in the post-Cold War period a number of people coming to power. Some of them have retired now, but they dominated let's say the 2000s and the 2010s. People who came from the left, very often from the anti-Soviet left, so Maoists, Trotskyites, and so on. Those people, I'm thinking of people like Tony Blair. Tony Blair was not formally a Trotskyite, but the only book I've ever heard him mention is Isaac Stern's biography of Trotsky. Barroso, José Manuel Barroso, you may remember him. He was president of the European Commission for, I think, 10 years. He was the leader of the Maoist youth wing in the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974. He then graduated, as you know, to Prime Minister of Portugal, European Commission President, and is now a director of Goldman Sachs. So the trajectory of these people, and there are many other examples. In France, Bernard-Henri Lévy, former Maoist, now big prophet of globalization. All these people simply changed. They say in French, they put their gun on the other shoulder. They simply
they changed to a camera.
Yeah, they changed the strategy, but the basic goal is the same, or the basic philosophy is the same, which is that. Which is, as I say, dialectical materialism and the primacy of change. And that's why these people can... The primacy of change is one of the reasons why conservatives are always losing. Because the change never stops coming. The new fronts never stop being opened. Okay, so 10 years ago,
In the meantime, everything that is dear and holy will get smashed.
And conservatives retreat, and they say, well, this time we're going to defend this redoubt, and then they retreat on that. So who expected gay marriage 10 years ago? I didn't expect it. I mean, there were a few indications that it was going to come onto the agenda, but there it was. It suddenly exploded, or rather suddenly, I say exploded because in France where I live, it caused a great counter-reaction. That battle was lost, launched unexpectedly and then lost by the Conservatives. And then here we are 10 years later, and suddenly the whole woke and transgender thing. I mean, who would have thought that, 10 years ago or 5 years ago that we would be talking about, having transvestite men in women's prisons and that kind of thing. So that's why conservatives keep losing, I think, is because the liberal, or if you like, Marxist project never rests. That is its very essence. It never rests. It is in constant. It is what Trotsky wanted, which is a permanent revolution. And as I say, the borderless world and the world of, when I say borderless, I'm not just referring to the borders between states, but of course the borders between male and female and between, normality and deviant behavior, all those borders, the idea that a world can be borderless, that is the very essence of this Heraclitean metaphysics. We have
a commercial about a Vodafone or a Ziggo or something with which you can go on the internet, and then they say, not because we have to, but because we can. Mm-hmm. So whatever we can do, we will do. And we don't think to stop. Should we do this?
Yes.
This is perhaps the abstract idea of a borderless society. Where you don't stop and think, should we do this?
Yes.
At all? So morality and ethics will be completely swept away, even from worth pondering over.
No, I think it's much worse than that. I think that technology is an instrument in the service of an ideological project. So I don't know what kind of, you've referred to the internet, but one might take transhumanism and or for that matter, transgenderism. These things might have been possible, perhaps not transhumanism, but some primitive forms of, yes, it will be, exactly. But it's not that the technology suddenly arrives and people think, oh gosh, now possibilities are opened. No, come on, the ancient Greeks could have flown. The ancient Greeks could have invented paragliding with silk and bamboo or whatever and light wood. Of course they could have done. But why didn't they jump off a cliff and try and fly and perhaps fall into the sea? Because of the myth of Icarus. They knew that would be a challenge to the gods. They had the whole Promethean mythology to prevent them. And a contrario today, we should indeed recoil from the idea of changing gender or trying to make people live until they're 150 or 200 years old or whatever. But instead, it's the other way around. It is the desire and of course the belief that nature can be controlled, that human nature can be changed, that the human mind can be downloaded into a computer and then re-uploaded into a new body and so on. These are projects. These are ideological projects. These are not things that. It's not just that, yes, we can, or because we can. It's that these things were conceived and the work is done on them by scientists with a political goal in mind. It's not the science, it's not the politics that's following the science, it's the science that's following the politics.
One of the arguments both science and politics use is that, same as with the arms race, we have to beat the opponent to it. So we will continue down this demonic path in development of trying to create babies in pods, trying to create plants that behave exactly the way we want to, yielding enormous produce on only 1 acre because of the climate, because of the environment, because of innovation. Yeah. Everybody hails the word innovation with it, which is one of the the idioms of change.
Yeah.
But they always say, let's beat the Chinese to it. Let's beat the Russians to it. We have to, let's pump money into Silicon Valley so that we come out ahead. I think this is a spiral downwards. It's a race to the bottom instead of to the top. Is there any way to suggest a conservative thought of saying, well, maybe we should halt for a moment?
Well, I think there are perhaps two things in what you say. I mean, to me, it's not necessarily, of course, within reason, objectionable to increase agricultural productivity, for example. I'm not sure quite exactly what things you're referring to, but it's
Monsanto, GMOs, genetic modification of organisms.
Yeah, okay, but right. So that's the distinction I would like to make. But if you find some way of, I don't know, improving productivity that goes with the grain of nature, then why not? That's fine. But indeed, if instead you are, because the Monsanto genetically modified thing is simply a way of making more money for Monsanto. Because, of course, the seeds don't reproduce and stuff like that. You have to keep buying them from Monsanto every year.
You're destroying nature.
And you are destroying nature, and you're working against nature, and you are seeking to make nature bend to, or change rather, to a preconceived idea. And that indeed is what's at the basis of, obviously, the climate ideology, the transgender ideology, and so on, the idea that man can control the heavens and that he can control human nature. So that's the distinction I would make. Whether it's justifiable in terms of competition, I very much doubt. I mean, again, I'm not familiar with this. I'm not particularly familiar with this claim. But if you take, since you mentioned China and Russia on the issue of transgenderism, that is actually something which that this issue has opened up a culture war with Russia and China. The Russian president called transgender operations offered to children in the West pure Satanism. He used the word pure Satanism. It's rare enough to hear a politician mention God. It's much rarer, even rarer, to hear a politician mention Satan. And yet there we are. And he
used to be a KGB agent, so he gets away with it, though.
Well, there we are. So, life is strange, isn't it? Full of surprises. But this denunciation of transgenderism is part of a geopolitical competition, yes, between great powers, which I would say is probably favorable to those countries that oppose it, in the sense that the West is alienating, I feel, a lot of countries through wokeism. That's geopolitically, that's not beneficial. So the idea that somehow whatever transgenderism or other unnatural pursuits are helping the West, or whatever the West means, or helping these countries in their competition with other powers, I'm not sure that that's going to succeed as a strategy. On the contrary, I think it's, you just literally see what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, said 2 or 3 weeks ago that every time he's on the phone to Riyadh, he talks about LGBT rights. Well, good luck for that. But what do we see with the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia? It's now more or less abandoning its more than 80-year-old alliance with the United States, and instead is turning towards China.
Do you believe there's truth in claims that China, for instance, through TikTok, is weakening the West deliberately?
I don't know. I'm skeptical about that.
Is the West weakening itself?
The West is weakening itself. That's my view. I can't claim to know China well, but I don't get the impression that China has a sufficiently universalist tradition to aim that high. Yes, China wants to prevent the West from dictating to it. Of course it does, and that explains its relationship, its alliance with Russia. But I don't see China. China, after all, in spite of its size and immensely long history, does not have a track record of universalism. It doesn't expand, China. So I would be skeptical that
One has to be a first, though.
Yep. Well, as I say, I'm answering with lots of caveats because I don't want to make a too affirmative statement about China. But if you're asking me about the weakening of the West, yes, I think the West is definitely weakening itself, not just through woke, not just through these ideologies, but instead through all its ideologies, of which woke and so on is only one manifestation. So the whole globalism, the whole, as I say, borderless world, the fact that our economies are drowning in debt, which is now, they're now trying to inflate away.
Well, you've mentioned how Barroso evolved into a partner at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
So I have a history of claiming that the foundation of all evil, when you take a problem and you go, you investigate it through 5 steps, you always come to money and the financial system.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I think that's a good way of looking at things. Follow the money. The only question mark I would put over that is that the central banks, in other words, state organisms, are also very much part of the problem. States themselves have created the casino capitalism and the debt culture that we live in by printing money, by imposing monopolistic fiat currency and then printing masses of it. So we shouldn't make an abstraction of the role of states. In other words, it's not just private finance, it's not just big banks, but also the states. Public debt and public finance, because after all, states control currencies, and currencies are the lifeblood of the financial system. So, but I suppose what I was referring to more by talking about
during COVID. Apologize for interrupting, but one more question about that. During COVID, you saw the doubling of the amount of dollars, and about the inflation for Europe was about 30%.
Yeah,
and we didn't see the same thing happen in Russia or in China.
Yeah.
So only in the West is hyperinflation around the corner.
Absolutely. That's because the West, the United States, Britain, Japan, and the European and the Eurozone have indeed, as everybody knows, printed industrial quantities of money since the financial crisis of 2008. All I wanted to say is something which I'm sure is obvious to you and maybe to your viewers, is that there is a complicity between the private banking system, which indeed is at the root of much evil, and states. I mean, after all, the response to the financial crisis of 2008 was run by states, and we've seen it again in recent weeks with these banking collapses. Okay, they've been, so Credit Suisse or whatever has been taken over by another Swiss bank. First Republican Bank has been taken over by JP Morgan and so on. But this is all done with the more than the support, with the complicity of states. And if there is inflation now, it's because states control the money supply. They print the money, and that leads to inflation. Whereas indeed, and of course, they run absolutely catastrophic levels of debt. The American debt, debt will never ever be repaid. This is debt that will never be repaid.
That's for the next generation. That's for this French girl.
It will never be repaid.
You cannot. It's impossible for the next generation, the next part of the population of mankind, to repay the debts that have been created in the past decade or 2 decades. It's impossible to repay them.
These young people will also, by the way, inherit, or not inherit, but they will contract private debt, because in Britain, for instance, students have to borrow to pay their university fees. So they will leave after 3 years doing a degree with tens of thousands, possibly 100,000 of debt. Which, of course, mirrors the huge accumulation of private debt elsewhere in the economy.
Is it a form of slavery and taxation?
Yes, of course, because it is deferred taxation. But when I say you'd say the next generation,
it's important for
when you say the next,
because they don't know that inflation is actually deferred. You've said it.
Inflation,
one of the first to say.
Inflation is theft. Inflation is a way of destroying people's assets, or certainly their financial holdings. in order to solve a debt problem. So yes, it is a form of debt, but it's extremely damaging. It's extremely damaging sociologically. We've been we're now in a particularly bad inflationary period, but actually we've been in a severe inflationary period for decades. In fact, probably since the 1970s, which of course was when the gold standard was finally abandoned. And in that period, from the 1970s, in all Western countries, certainly in Britain, but I'm sure this is true of the Netherlands, there has been very severe inflation in certain sectors, in particular in property. And of course, property inflation has a massively negative impact on society, because it means people can't afford homes. They can't afford housing. They have to move further and further away from where they work. They have to travel further and further to get to work in the day. I was in London last week, and
but the globalists have a solution for that.
A very brilliant speaker said that he thought the most effective contraceptive method ever invented by man was the London property market.
But yeah, because you look at it and you go like, we can't have children here.
Yeah,
they're not safe. Yeah. There's no parks. There's no green. There's no schools. There's no teachers. Yeah. There's actually no healthcare in the city center of Amsterdam. Yeah. You won't find a teacher, a school, or a nurse anywhere.
And all these countries therefore have accumulated debt, which of course is indeed living off the cost of the taxation that will be paid by future generations. But the scale of it is so immense that we can't even talk about the next generation. The debt that's currently accumulated will never be paid off. It cannot be paid off.
But the globalists have a solution for this, and I'd like to ask you about that, because they who create the problem might actually create the problem because they want a different kind of solution. It's a cultural hijack.
Well, that's the Great Reset, which is here I am. I am an arsonist, and now I'm going to play the role of firefighter.
What will that entail for this generation that's now depressed? We have 50% of people between 15 and 25 who are depressed. The other 50% is depressed, but they don't know it. They feel depressed because they feel that there's a debt above their head that they can't ever pay. They feel enslaved. They feel this solution coming their way. And that's why there were tears in the eyes of the 20-year-old girl in France. And that's why she asked, what can we do? So if this is the truth, and we already know this before it happens, how can it be that the world that consists of people who have morality and who enjoy freedom and who enjoy a social structure, which is actually a conservative virtue more than it is a liberal virtue or a left-wing virtue, how can it be that there is no conservative answer to the problem that isn't here yet and we can see it coming?
Well, firstly, yes, indeed, we can see it coming, because the depression that you describe is not a result of a feeling. It's a result of an observation of reality. Every young person today knows, it's not just a matter of feeling, knows that they will not have the same standard of living as their parents. All right? If you're British or Dutch or I imagine, or French or whatever nationality, you can see that you will not be able to afford even a flat, let alone a house, where you may well have grown up in a house, but you can't even afford a flat, let alone a house. So it's just an objective fact. What you're asking me again the same question, what can we do? But you said we who love freedom. That's in a way my greatest fear. I don't think people love freedom. Generally, some people might love freedom, but a lot of people don't like freedom. Freedom means responsibility. That's why most people fear it. I think that was Erich Fromm or possibly Hayek. I can't remember who said that, but I remember Mrs. Thatcher quoted it.
I agree.
We saw in the lockdowns that the lockdowns had a very high level of support. At least if we
was a warm bath of comfort for those who lack responsibility.
In an atomized society, in a society which is already atomized and already gangrened by solitude, because, as we all know, social networks and iPhones actually make people lonely. In fact, we're not connected, we're disconnected. In those circumstances, those are the perfect circumstances in which people, this is all in Hannah Arendt and so on, they then move towards the protective state. So I think the cause of freedom is I would say, a minority pursuit. Most people, for emotional and psychological reasons, were very, very happy at the lockdowns. They enjoyed staying at home. They enjoyed not having to work. They enjoyed being paid to do nothing, but they also enjoyed the sense of comfort and the sense that someone was looking after them.
Because the truth is so uncomfortable?